Hello again. Wrought in iron above the gates of Dachau, the first concentration camp in Nazi Germany, were the words Arbeit macht frei. In German, this literally means work brings freedom, work makes you free. The implication is that work will bring as its reward freedom. This same slogan was later placed over the entrance to Auschwitz, and it has been widely accepted that this was a fiendish black joke on the part of the SS, in that they knew very well there was not the slightest possibility of any of the slave labourers in the camps being made free by their work. In fact, it's altogether possible that rather than being placed there cynically as a taunt to the prisoners, this phrase was used quite honestly by those who set up the camps, and that it expressed some mystical reverence for the idea of physical work. The expression Arbeit macht frei was not dreamed up by the Nazis, but was actually a slogan of the Weimar Republic, which preceded the Third Reich. Even they didn't invent the wording. It's from a German novel published in 1873 by Lorenz Diffenbach. The title of the book was Arbeit macht frei, and it tells of the redemption of a group of dissolute gamblers by honest hard work. This concept that there is something virtuous and liberating about physical work for its own sake was common in the middle of the 20th century, and it lingers on to this day. Unemployment is even now seen sometimes as undesirable, not simply because it reduces men to poverty, but because the enforced idleness which goes hand in hand with unemployment is viewed as a moral evil, which saps the vitality and worth of those without jobs, leading them on a downward path, which is like to end in apathy and vice. The labour camps, set up and run in remote rural parts of Britain from 1929 until the outbreak of war in the summer of 1939, were different from the labour camps of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. They were, at least in theory, voluntary establishments from which any of the inmates could walk out whenever they pleased. There was, however, a good deal more to it than that. Despite their supposedly voluntary nature, there were eerie similarities between them and the camps set up in Germany at the same time by the Nazis. The idea of both was that men should be reclaimed through honest labour, and that those who had hitherto led idle or vicious lives could redeem themselves through hard, purely physical work. Few readers would be unfamiliar with the image of poor starved Oliver Twist in the workhouse saying, "Please, sir, I want some more." The institutions of the workhouses in Victorian England were understood by everybody today to have been a bad thing. Those images bring to us the idea of hungry children, husbands separated from wives and so on. They were meant to be bad places, little better than prisons, and the idea was to discourage people from being workless, to discourage them from being poor. Hardly anybody ever walked out of those workhouses, though, despite the fact that they weren't prisons, because they knew the alternative was starvation. Until the passing of the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, commonly known as the New Poor Law, those in England who were poverty-stricken due to unemployment could apply for help from the parish in which they lived, and it was provided often in the form of outdoor relief, which was money or food distributed to the poor who remained living in their own homes. This was felt in the 19th century to have developed into a bit of a racket, and it was thought that it encouraged people to be idle if you just handed them out money or food because they were out of work. So the idea was to make being unemployed unpleasant and to make it clear to people that it was better for them to work than to stay on the dole. Surprisingly, workhouses weren't officially abolished until the passing of the 1929 Local Government Act, which came into force on 1st of April 1930. Right up until that time, within living memory, just about, there were workhouses in this country. Some were renamed public assistance institutions, and they continued operating for another decade or so. As late as 1939, the year that the Second World War began, there were still 100,000 people in such establishments. That included over 5,000 children. At about the same time that the workhouses were being abolished, a Labour government led by Ramsay MacDonald was getting to grips with the effects of the Great Depression. This gloomy period of economic stagnation gripped the world from 1930 until roughly the end of World War II. In some parts of Britain, unemployment rose to shocking levels. 30% of workers in Glasgow were out of work at the height of the Depression. This was roughly the figure for South Wales as a whole. Unemployment was worst in industrial and mining areas. The unemployment rate in the Welsh town of Taswell was 82%. In the south of Britain, things were better and agriculture was experiencing a boom during the 1930s. It was thought that if some of those unemployed miners and factory workers could be persuaded to move away from what were known as the distressed areas of high unemployment and go where there were jobs to be found in the rural economy of southeast England, that maybe a lot of the suffering that was being experienced in the north of England and in Wales could be alleviated. When Ramsay MacDonald formed a minority Labour government in the summer of 1929, he appointed the first ever woman to the cabinet. Margaret Bondfield was 56 and she had previously been a junior minister in MacDonald's 1924 administration. Now she was given the post of Minister of Labour. At that time, unemployment was already a serious problem. Over 1 million people were either on the dole or claiming unemployment benefit. The previous Conservative government under Stanley Baldwin had tinkered with the problem of long-term unemployment, but without any noticeable result. Now the new Minister of Labour was determined to tackle the scourge head-on. Under the Conservatives, a number of centres had been set up to retrain men and equip them with skills which might enable them to be more attractive to potential employers. Those who were claiming the dole were invited to attend these institutions, but there was a marked reluctance amongst the unemployed to travel miles to stay in residential centres, as this would mean leaving their friends and families behind. On the 23rd of December 1929, Margaret Bondfield told the Cabinet that she wanted to remove any choice in the matter and compel men to go and live in what were now termed transfer instructional centres. She said at the Cabinet meeting that day that she was most concerned about men who were unlikely to obtain work without a course of reconditioning, and referred bitterly to those who refused to avail themselves of the offer of training. There sounds something a little sinister about the idea of reconditioning men, but Bondfield wasn't the only person in the Ministry of Labour who was using this expression. It's time to look at what these transfer instructional centres, later simply called instructional centres, actually were. To all intents and purposes, they were labour camps where soft men would be reconditioned and hardened. This process would be accomplished by means of rough living for months, during which the men would spend their days engaged in the heaviest kind of physical labour, digging ditches, breaking stones, felling trees and sawing timber. The camps were all in remote, out-of-the-way places, and the intention was that after they had been reconditioned, it might be possible for some of the men to obtain work of this sort on the land, far from the areas of high unemployment from which they came. Accommodation in the camps was basic, similar perhaps to that provided in an army barracks. The food was adequate and filling, and the men sent there lived a life in many ways like that of soldiers. They were issued with heavy work clothes and cutlery and lived in wooden huts. The compulsion used to get men to agree to leave their homes and live under fairly harsh conditions of this sort was simple but devastatingly effective. Those who refused to take up a place at the camp to which they had been allocated would no longer be entitled to any unemployment benefit or dole. For men with families, this was a most potent means of persuasion, involving, as it did, the threat of hardship and even starvation for their wives and children. It's instructive to compare what was happening in Britain with similar projects being undertaken in Nazi Germany at roughly the same time. On the 20th of March 1933, the office of Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, issued a press release about a new facility which was being set up near Munich. Communist functionaries, Reichsbanner and Marxist functionaries who threatened the security of the state will be assembled here, leaving individual communist functionaries in the courthouse jails is not possible for the long term without putting too much strain on the apparatus of the state. Life in the new camps didn't sound particularly disagreeable. The Dachau camp consisted of 20 one- or two-story stone buildings, each of which could hold 200 to 250 men. The idea was that would be increased eventually to between 3,000 and 5,000. And that the men would start working straight away on the land and then given the possibility of settling there and taking up jobs in agriculture once they had spent a spell in Dachau, in the labour camp. There were few differences between the regime at Dachau and that at the labour camps which were being opened first by the Labour government and then later the national government in 1930s Britain. Just as in Britain, there was the idea that reconditioning men might be good for them, combined with the possibility that they might wish to move to another part of the country and earn their daily bread in this way in the future. According to Himmler's office, this was just the sort of thing that was going on at the Third Reich's first concentration camp. After the inmates had learnt how to work properly, those same men might even wish to stay at Dachau and settle on the land permanently. As a matter of fact, there almost certainly were very few differences between Dachau and the British labour camps at that time. One person who visited Dachau concentration camp in 1936 and was very favourably impressed by what he saw was former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. He talked enthusiastically of the virtues of good honest labour and spoke of the men he had seen stripped to their waists who were digging ditches around the camp. For Lloyd George at least, the idea that Arbeit macht frei was a sound and desirable one. He wasn't the only British visitor to the German concentration camps to find the treatment of the inmates quite acceptable. There can be no doubt that in the 1930s, both in Germany and Britain, there was a feeling that Arbeit did indeed macht frei. Nothing like a spot of digging ditches and so on for toughening men up and making them fit to live once more in ordinary society. It is perhaps significant that while the British had named their camps instructional centres, the Germans at first intended that their own similar establishments should be known as re-education centres. Whatever the name eventually chosen, the camps themselves were astonishingly similar. At the time, the instructional centres were generally referred to by those being sent to them as work camps or labour camps. Some left-wing political groups denounced them as concentration camps. This was a touchy point for those actually running the places, with the German camps beginning to acquire an unwholesome reputation for themselves. Few officials in Britain wished to be thought of as connected with concentration camps. Even the word camp was avoided wherever possible. In 1935, an official of the Unemployment Assistance Board was worried about the terminology being used by civil servants. He wrote, "Above all, the word camp must never be applied to any open-air training schemes. The communist orators and pamphleteers have been quick to play upon the unpleasant association of ideas by denouncing such organisations as concentration camps." The financial crisis that Ramsay MacDonald's administration faced was infinitely worse than any facing the government before or since. Our own problems pale into insignificance economically between what was happening then. The national government hit upon the idea of slashing all payments and all wages by 10%, and then taking steps to see if they couldn't avoid paying out money altogether to some unemployed families. This was done by the much hated means test. At first, dole was distributed by the local public assistance committees, which had replaced the old poor law guardians. But in 1934, a National Assistance Board was created, which dictated to the last penny exactly how much assistance should be offered to the unemployed. This then was the stick, as you might say, to get people to go to those camps, to get the men to go to the camps. If they refused to take up the offer of spending 3 or 6 months in the labour camp, then they would receive no further money at all from the state, and their families were literally at the risk of starvation. This was one fear, was being on the dole for years, that men would grow flabby and soft, and that the idea was that they got so used to being on the dole and just lolling around that they needed really a short, sharp shock to get them shifting, to make them realise that they had to work somehow or other. They were thought to be soft and flabby, and the idleness had sapped their morale, leaving them lazy and apathetic. What they needed was rousing up and being given a bit of a shock to get them moving again. They also needed to be prepared psychologically for the idea that they might have to leave where they were currently living and move to the other end of the country. Most of them had previously worked in factories, mines and shipyards, but these jobs simply weren't available. So they would have to learn how to do forestry and logging, work on the land. It's interesting to think that at the same time that Dachau was operating a precisely similar system, the British government, under a Labour Prime Minister, was pursuing very similar policies. But we seem to have forgotten all about this now. One of the things that the men who spent their 3 month periods at those camps to begin with remarked upon was that the work appeared to be undertaken for its own sake. It wasn't really training anybody in anything useful. Stones were quarried and broken into small pieces with sledgehammers, which was much the same sort of work that was being done by prisoners at Dartmoor. It was as though they were being made to undertake hard physical labour for no other reason than to make them exhausted. I thought it was worth talking about this today because, of course, there's an awful lot. There are 5 million people on benefits related to unemployment in this country at the moment. I'm not suggesting for a moment that we should open labour camps of this sort now, but it's curious to see that in the 1930s, it was seen as a serious problem if men were on the dole for more than a year, and today we seem to have accepted the point.